And also, there's an order corresponding to this ideology of multilingualism. So in that order, the Chinese state envisioned minority languages as satellites to Han Chinese language. Okay, specifically, in the 50s, the Chinese government developed over 10 standard languages and writing systems for those minority languages based on the assumption that those languages, oral and written, would be used in the minority communities in their centers. And then, for example, languages centers were chosen from Miao and Yi communities. That was the expectation. Those centers will play a bigger role in socio-economic development, in cultural and political development, that the standard language of a minority community will expand to the whole community. At the same time, of course, Chinese served as the language for the whole nation. And in that model, the plan was to bridge minority languages in Chinese with Chinese loans. So for socio-economic development, loans of Chinese will be borrowed into Tibetan and other minority languages. And also, the state was developing this pinyin system, pinyin romanization. And at that time, it was envisioned this pinyin romanization is the base for all writing systems in China for all the minority languages. So that's in some way in the future, how that's minority languages will be looking more and more like Chinese in terms of writing system, in terms of the terminology. So that's the grand vision. And of course, that was the ideal. And there were conflicts within this model. The question is, how long will this take? So is it, say, 10 years, 20 years, or 200 years? So the accommodation list, the people who want to accommodate differences assume this is a long process. So it takes many, many years. And also within the Chinese government and the CCP, the people who think, okay, we can do this overnight during the great leap forward. So that strategy was, we just abandon the system and we just teaching minorities Chinese. So there was conflict even within this model. Now, this model was basically interrupted during the Cultural Revolution. That's in the 66 to 76. So when that was over, the model was restored. So Tibetan and other minority languages were encouraged to be used in schools. However, then the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, that changed the picture. Long before the fall of the Soviet Union, beginning with the economic reform in China in the late 1970s. Usually we call it economic reform, but actually it's more than economic reform. It's a reform of the whole approach to China. So how much China still wants socialism or wants the traditional Marxist-Leninist approach is more than that. As you know, eventually China abandoned socialism as we know and adopted capitalism in a way different from what we have here. So actually, starting in the 80s, the Chinese government were thinking about the approach, the political approach to China and the political approach to the national question. in the Marxist tradition. Anyway, that was not high on the agenda. There was no rush until 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. For a while, the CCP leadership was disoriented. They didn't know what to do until Deng Xiaoping made his trip to southern China, which pointed the direction. Let's continue with the reform. So at the same time, the Chinese government set up many task forces to try to learn the lessons from the fall of the Soviet Union. To a large extent, the Chinese government believed the fall of the Soviet Union was caused by its minority policies. So, of course, if we look into this, it's more than that. But at least that was one of the lessons the Chinese government drew in the 90s. So the Chinese government decided to abandon this multinational state building model. It was trying to find a new model. And that new model it happened in 1989. A famous Chinese anthropologist and sociologist, Fei Xiaotong, made a speech in Hong Kong. And in that speech, he proposed a theory of what he calls the inclusive Chinese nation with diversity. That's my translation. The Chinese version is 中华民族多元一体. So that was academic, a scholarly speech. However, because of the timing, that speech was in 1989, and the Chinese government immediately see an opportunity, see this could be a replacement for the Soviet model of multinational state building. Now, let me elaborate a little bit on Fei Xiaotong's theory. So in this theory, he proposes one inclusive Chinese nation with 56 ethnic groups. So that includes the Han. So here are two levels of identities. There's inclusive Chinese nation national identity and ethnic identities for Hans, Tibetans, Mongolians, Uyghurs, etc. Okay. And his theory also thinks that in the development of this one nation with diversity, the Han played the core role, but all the minorities played a big role too. So they evolved, this nation, this inclusive Chinese nation, evolved beyond the Han. So it's more than the Han. And another idea of this scholarship is the cohesiveness of this nation. That's because the belief that in the development for this inclusive Chinese nation, the people developed a common pursuit for the same fate or the same of this whole nation. They embrace all this successfulness or the failures or the fate of this nation.